The sun was an anvil, and the land near the Ash River border was the metal being beaten flat. It was a place of cracked earth and skeletal choya, where the wind carried nothing but heat and the memory of dust. Caleb Rourke rode the fence line, his gaze automatic. The posts were weak, the wire rusted, but it was his line. It was all that separated his patch of dirt, the Rourke Ranch, from the nothingness that stretched west. He was a man past 30, though the desert had carved lines that suggested more. His eyes, recessed under the brim of his hat, held the flat, patient look of a man who expects nothing good. He had been a scout for the army, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone younger and far more stupid. Now he was just a rancher, trying to hold together an empty house. His horse, a sturdy bay named Old John, stopped short, ears flicking. Caleb's hand didn't move toward the rifle in its scabbard, but his whole body went still. He leaned over the saddle horn. There, stark against the pale grit, was the stain. It was not fresh. It was old blood, already baked black and flaking at the edges. It led from a cluster of mesquite, a dark, continuous smear, accompanied by the unsteady, dragging tracks of a shod horse, a horse favoring one leg, badly. Two clear choices presented themselves in Caleb's mind, as clean as a fresh-cut card deck. The first was the smart one. Turn Old John around, ride back to the relative safety of his cabin, bar the door, and forget what he saw. It was not his business. This land bled daily, and chasing every stain was a fool's errand. The second choice was the one for a man carrying too many ghosts, the one for a man who still heard things in the dead of night. Caleb. Haunted by the specific shadow of an Apache raid, he had been part of the smell of burning hides, and a sound he never spoke of nudged his horse forward. He chose the second path. He followed the trail for the better part of an hour, the sun climbing to its zenith, pressing on his shoulders like a physical weight. The tracks led him away from the river, deeper into the broken territory, toward a small fortress of red rock, the kind of place that looked solid from a distance, but was really just a pile of sun-scorched boulders, offering shade but no water. The trail ended at the mouth of a narrow opening between two massive stones. The smell hit him first, the copper tang of blood mixed with sweat, and the unmistakable scent of fear. He dismounted, his boots making no sound on the soft sand. He left Old John 50 yards back, his rifle still in its scabbard. He kept only the revolver on his hip, his hand deliberately resting on his belt buckle, not the grip. He rounded the first boulder. They were there. 2 women, Apache, and they were, as the stories claimed, enormous. One was slumped against the rock wall, her head lolled back, a dark, wet map of blood spreading across the buckskin covering her torso. Her breathing was a shallow rattle. The other one stood in front of her, a living shield. She was tall, nearly his own height of 6 feet, but broader in the shoulder than he was. Her arms were corded with muscle, and in her hands, she held a long, fire-hardened spear, its stone tip aimed directly at his heart. Her face was a mask of dried sweat, dirt, and absolute fury. Her eyes were black pits, promising a violent death to anyone who took one more step. The standing woman spoke, her voice a low growl, ripped raw from a dry throat. Her English was broken, shattered like pottery. "Tala!" She motioned with her chin to the spear. Then she nodded at the woman on the ground. "Naili!" Recognition hit Caleb like a physical blow. Tala and Naili. He'd heard the names whispered around campfires at Fort Horizon, spoken by soldiers who tried to sound brave and failed. The giant sisters of Red Mesa. Legends credited them with raids that defied logic, with strength that matched any 2 men. They were not just women, they were symbols. And here, one was dying, and the other was ready to join her. "Go!" Tala spat. "This is Red Mesa business, not for white man, not for blue coat." Her eyes flickered to his belt, the way he stood, the worn cavalry cut of his jeans. She knew what he was, what he had been. Caleb kept his hands exactly where they were, open and away from his gun. He could see the exhaustion trembling in Tala's arms, the way she favored her left leg. She was wounded, too, just hiding it better. He knew that stance. It was the last wall before collapse. Slowly, deliberately. He unhooked his canteen from his saddle horn. He'd brought old John closer while Tala was focused on his face. He unstrapped the leather saddlebag. He moved with the slow, predictable rhythm of a man tending livestock, not approaching a threat. He placed the canteen on the sand, a good 5 paces from her. Then, he took out the contents of his bag, a cloth-wrapped parcel of hardtack and a piece of dry, salted beef. He crouched, breaking the biscuit-hard bread into smaller, more manageable pieces. The sound of it snapping was loud in the sudden silence. He laid the pieces on the cloth next to the canteen. He stood up, hands raised slightly, palms out. "If you mean to kill me," Caleb said, his voice as dry as the air. "Wait until after you've eaten." A muscle in Tala's jaw jumped. The sun-cracked skin of her face seemed to pull tight over her high cheekbones. He watched the war inside her. He saw the pure, undiluted hatred for his kind for him battle the primal, desperate need to save the woman dying at her feet. The instinct to survive. Hatred lost. Survival won. With a sound that was half-groan, half-snarl, Tala lowered the spear tip until it rested on the sand. She did not take her eyes off him. She backed up 2 steps, then collapsed to her knees beside Nayeli. Her movements were stiff, pained. She snatched the canteen, uncorked it, and pressed it to her sister's lips, letting only a few drops spill past her cracked mouth. Nayeli coughed, a wet, terrible sound. Then, Tala took one of the pieces of hardtack. She dipped it in the water to soften it, and pushed it into Nayeli's hand, closing her sister's fingers around it. She forced her sister to eat. It was just an act of desperation. That is all Caleb saw. A man giving water to a dying animal. A woman forcing her sister to take sustenance. He had no way of knowing what he had just done. He did not know the old laws. He did not know that, among the Red Mesa people, this act, the giving of food and water by an outsider to one of their own on the brink of death, was not kindness. It was a binding, a ritual that tied the giver to the taker with a debt that could only be paid in blood or in life. He was, in that moment, completely ignorant of the chain he had just fastened around his own neck. Nayeli choked down the moistened bread, her body shaking with the effort. Tala did not eat. She kept her gaze fixed on Caleb, a new, complex emotion warring with the hatred. It was suspicion, confusion. "Why?" she demanded, her voice still a rasp. "You rode with them, the men who hunt us. Why help?" Caleb looked away. He could not meet that stare. He looked past her, to the red rocks, to the shimmering heat rising from the desert floor. He thought of the lodge, the smoke, and the sound. "I stood with the men who burned your lodges," he whispered, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "I heard them, and that is why—" He met her eyes then, his own filled with a hollowness that matched hers. "That is exactly why I cannot leave you here to die on the sand." He had not come here to be a savior. He had come here to silence a ghost. The sun began its long, merciless descent, painting the rocks in shades of blood and fire. The fragile truce held. Tala watched him, her mind clearly turning, weighing the certainty of death here against the unknown. Impossible risk of trusting him. Finally, she nodded, a single, sharp jerk of her head. He moved forward, and she did not raise the spear. "She cannot ride alone," he said. Tala grunted. "We ride together, or not at all." He knew his horse could not carry all 3 of them, not for long, but he could carry 2. "I will walk." He helped Tala get her sister to her feet. The moment he put his hands on Nayeli to lift her, he felt the sheer density of her. She was tall, but it was the solid weight of muscle and bone, even weakened as she was. She was heavy, a burden he could barely manage. He grunted with the effort, hoisting her up into the saddle. She slumped forward, barely conscious. Then he turned to Tala. She needed help too, though her pride fought against it. He put his hands on her waist to steady her as she climbed up behind her sister, her movements stiff with her own hidden injuries. For the first time, his hands spanned the breadth of her body. He felt the solid muscle of her back, the rigid set of her spine, the heat radiating from her skin even as the air began to cool. She settled behind Naeli, creating a living brace to hold her sister upright. Caleb took the reins of old John. He gave one last look at the bloody sand and the abandoned spear. Tala had left it, a sign of trust, or a sign she was too weak to carry it, he did not know. He began to walk, leading the horse east, toward the Rourke Ranch. As the shadows stretched long and purple across the desert, he saw it, far to the south, in the direction of Fort Horizon. A thin, unnervingly straight column of smoke climbed into the twilight sky. It was not a campfire. It was a signal. A scout patrol. They had found the trail. They were following. Tala saw it too. Her head lifted, and she stared at the smoke, her profile hard as flint against the dying light. She muttered something low, in her own tongue. The words were guttural, rhythmic, a prayer, or a curse. He thought he heard a phrase about riders, about a house, about the one who gave food. Caleb paid it no mind. He dismissed it as the sound of the wind, pulling at the dusk. He just kept walking, leading his horse, and the two giant women who were now his burden, toward home. It was full dark by the time they reached the Rourke Ranch. The trek had been made in a grueling, heavy silence, broken only by Naeli's pained breathing and the crunch of Caleb's boots on the gravelly soil. The ranch was not much. It was a scar of human effort on a vast, indifferent landscape of golden grass that faded to gray in the moonlight. There was the main cabin, built of sturdy cottonwood, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, and a web of split-rail fencing, broken in more places than it was whole. This was Caleb's world, a place of solitude, bought with his discharge pay and haunted by the ghosts of a wife and a small son taken by the scarlet fever that had swept through Ash River 2 winters prior. He lived here alone, because the silence was the only thing that felt honest anymore. He led them not to the house, but to the barn, his steps quickening. He pulled old John into the shadows at the rear, sliding the heavy door on its leather hinges just wide enough to pass. "Inside, both of you," he ordered, his voice low. He unsaddled his horse in the dark, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He brought water for old John and for the sister's exhausted mount, which he'd tied in the furthest, darkest stall. "Stay here. Do not go near the doors. Do not make a sound," he said, looking at Tala. "The patrols from Fort Horizon ride through here whenever they please, looking for water or whiskey, and the folk in town, they pay good money for Apache hair. Understand?" Tala's eyes, adjusted to the gloom, glittered. She understood bounties. She nodded, her hand still resting on the hilt of a knife at her belt. Caleb left them in the straw-scented darkness and went to the cabin. He moved like a man expecting visitors, checking the perimeter before striking a match inside. The single room was sparse: a cot, a cold stove, a table with 1 chair, and a small shelf of medical supplies from his army days. On the wall hung a small, faded tintype of a woman and a child. He turned its face to the wall before lighting the lamp. He built a small fire in the stove, just enough to heat, not enough to send a plume of smoke. He put the coffee pot on and dumped a can of beans into a skillet, mashing them into a crude soup with a little water and bacon fat. The smell filled the cabin, a lonely, domestic scent. After 10 minutes, he went back to the barn. He carried the skillet, 2 tin plates, and the steaming coffee pot. He found them huddled in an empty stall. Naeli was lying on her side, her breathing still worryingly shallow. Tala sat bolt upright beside her back to the wall, watching the doorway like a cornered wolf. She had not relaxed for a second. Caleb set the plates down. "It's not much, but it's hot." He poured coffee into the tin cups. Tala took hers, but did not drink. She just held it, letting the heat sink into her hands. Caleb crouched by Naeli. "How is the wound?" he asked, his voice slipping into the professional, detached tone of a man who had seen too many. He'd been a field medic's assistant for a year. It was a job he'd been good at, a job he'd hated. "She bleeds," Tala said. "I need to see it. The bullet is still in her." "Is it not?" Before Tala could answer, Naeli stirred. Her eyes opened, hazy with pain but more lucid than they had been on the trail. She was younger than Tala. He saw now, perhaps barely 20. "He shot us," Nayeli whispered, her English surprisingly clear, though accented. "Elias, he led them—" "Hush, little sister," Tala murmured. "No." Nayeli pushed herself up on one elbow, her massive frame trembling. "He must know. He brought us here." She looked at Caleb, her gaze sharp and intelligent despite the pain. "They came at dawn. Many soldiers, led by Major Pike, and Elias Crow. He is Red Mesa. He was our blood. He led them to the hidden camp. For money." Caleb's blood did not just run cold. It stopped. His hand, reaching for Nayeli's bandage, froze in midair. Major Harlan Pike. The name was a brand on his own memory. Pike, the man who gave the orders. Pike, the man who believed the only good Apache was a dead one. Pike, his own former commanding officer. The man whose orders he had followed when he'd set the torch to that lodge. A cold dread settled in his gut. This was not a random act of violence he had stumbled upon. This was the harvest. And he, Caleb Rourke, had helped plant the seeds years ago. These endless, bloody circles of revenge, he was not just a witness. He was part of the cause. Tala, watching his face, saw the change. She saw the blood drain from it, the flicker of sick recognition in his eyes. "You know him," she stated. It was not a question. Caleb could not lie. He nodded, pulling his hand back. "He was my commander. When I was a scout." The air in the barn turned to ice. Tala moved so fast he barely saw it. One moment she was sitting, the next she was on her feet, the knife from her belt halfway from its sheath, its blade gleaming in the thin shaft of moonlight from a crack in the wall. "You rode with him," she hissed, the words full of venom. "You rode with the butcher." "That was a long time ago," Caleb said, raising his hands slowly. "I left that life. There is no leaving it." Tala's voice was a raw cry of grief and rage. "You wear the blue coat. You are the blue coat. You kill our children. You burn our homes. And then you leave and call yourself a rancher. You are all the same." "I am not him," Caleb said, his voice hard. "You stood with him. You held the torch, did you not?" she accused. Stepping closer, the knife was fully out now. "How many did you kill, white man, before you decided to grow beans?" "Tala, stop," Nayeli pleaded, her voice weak. "He helped us." "He led us into a new trap," Tala spat, her gaze locked on Caleb. "This is his house. Pike will come here. He knows you. He will find us, and you will give us to him." "I will not," Caleb said. The accusation struck a nerve, and his own anger flared, hot and defensive. "I left because of men like Pike. I left because I could not wash the smell of smoke from my hands. I have lost everything, too. Do not stand there and tell me who I am." "You have lost nothing?" Tala gestured wildly. "Your people are not hunted. Your children are not shot in their blankets. You know nothing of loss." The words hit him harder than a fist. He flinched, his mind flashing to the small, cold tintype, to the 2 wooden markers behind the cabin. "You are wrong," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with a pain so old it was part of his bones. "You are dead wrong." They stared at each other, 2 people defined by what they had buried. The air crackled with their shared and separate griefs, with a hatred that was suddenly confused, standing on uneven ground. A sharp, ragged cough broke the standoff. Nayeli had fallen back, her hand pressed to her side. Dark blood was seeping through the crude bandage he had applied on the trail. She was bleeding again, heavily. The fury vanished from Caleb's face, replaced by the grim focus of the medic. The argument was over. Life was draining onto the straw. "She will die if I do not stop that," he said flatly. "Get out of my way." "Tala!" Tala hesitated, her body torn between the urge to kill him and the need to save her sister. She looked at the spreading stain, then at his face. She stepped aside. Caleb dropped to his knees. "I need light, and my bag. It is in the house, on the shelf." Tala did not move. "Do you want her to live?" he snapped. Go! The lantern is by the door. My bag is on the wall. Tala ran from the barn. Caleb turned back to Nayeli, gently cutting away the blood-soaked buckskin. The wound was deep, high on the abdomen. Bad! Tala returned, her large frame filling the doorway. She carried the lit lantern and his leather satchel. She hung the lantern on a nail, flooding the stall with yellow, flickering light. Hold her, he said. Hold her still. She is going to fight me. He opened his satchel. Carbolic, bandages, a needle. Gut. He poured whiskey from his flask onto the blade of his knife and then onto his hands. Nayeli moaned as the smell hit her. Easy, girl. Easy, he murmured. His hands, which had been trembling with anger moments before, now becoming perfectly steady. He had to get the bullet out. He sat beside her. He looked at Tala. Hold her hand. Talk to her. In your own tongue. Keep her here. Tala knelt on the other side of her sister. She took Nayeli's hand, a hand nearly as large as her own. She began to speak, a low, soft chant that sounded like running water. Caleb took a breath and began to work. He found the bullet lodged against a rib. As he probed, Nayeli screamed, her body arching off the straw, her strength still formidable. Hold her! Caleb yelled. Tala threw her own body across her sister's shoulders, pinning her, her face pressed against Nayeli's, her own tears of rage and fear mixing with her sister's sweat. Caleb worked fast. He pulled the shard of lead free, dropping it with a wet click into a tin plate. He packed the wound, his fingers moving with a grim, practiced delicacy. He began to stitch. As he worked, he was intensely aware of the two women, of their size, their power, the fierce, protective love between them. And he was aware of Nayeli, watching him. Her eyes were open, wide with pain, but also with a strange, piercing curiosity. He tied the last stitch. He placed a clean bandage soaked in carbolic over the wound. It is done, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. He sat back on his heels, the front of his shirt dark with Nayeli's blood. Tala slowly released her sister. Nayeli's breathing was already easier, the rattling gone. She looked at Caleb, her dark eyes luminous in the lamplight. Thank you, she whispered. Just those two words. Caleb only nodded. Unable to speak, he began cleaning his tools. Tala watched him. She had seen him fight her, seen him threaten, and now she had seen him save. She watched the way his hands, stained with her sister's blood, carefully cleaned the needle. He had touched Nayeli not as a white man touched an Indian, not as a prize or a savage, but as a man trying to mend something broken. A fine, hairline crack appeared in the wall of her hatred. She hated him for it. She hated this confusion. She hated that her sister had thanked this man, this former bluecoat. She turned away, angry at him, but angrier at herself for the weakness of letting him help. The night deepened. Caleb brought blankets from the house. He sat with his back against the barn door, his rifle across his knees, while the two sisters finally slept. Hours later, the moon was high. Caleb must have dozed, because he woke to the feeling of a presence. He opened his eyes. Tala was no longer in the stall. He saw her standing in the open doorway of the barn, a massive silhouette against the indigo sky. She was looking out over the dark grasslands, toward the south. He got up, his joints aching, and stood a few feet behind her. You should sleep, he said. She did not turn. I cannot. The earth is not quiet. It is just the wind. Tala. No, she said. Her voice was low. Certain. It is the sound of horses, too far to hear. But they are coming. It is the sound of a debt being called. She looked out at the silent, empty plains. My people believe the ground trembles when great numbers are moving to collect what they are owed. Caleb looked out. Too. He saw nothing but the vast, starry emptiness. He heard nothing but the crickets. He looked back at Tala. She had climbed onto the top rail of the broken fence, sitting there as if it were a throne, her back straight, her face to the stars. She looked less like a woman and more like a guardian carved from the rock of the red mesa itself. He felt a strange, unwelcome pull, a part of him, the lonely, empty part, wanted to walk out there, to stand beside her, to share the silence. But another, wiser part held him back, a cold voice of self-preservation. He knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that to step closer to her was to be dragged inextricably into her war. He stayed in the shadow of the barn, watching her dark shape against the sky. A man caught between a past he could not escape and a future that was about to come crashing down on his home. The silence of the ranch was a living thing, a heavy blanket that Caleb had pulled around himself for 2 years. Tonight, it was torn apart. It started not as a sound, but as a vibration through the cabin's floorboards, a distant, rhythmic pounding. Then, the sound reached him hoofbeats, too many of them, and not the disciplined tread of a patrol. This was the sloppy, confident gait of riders who owned the night. They were followed by a burst of low, coarse laughter that slid under the cabin door like a snake. Caleb was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, the instincts of his former life flooding his veins with ice. He moved to the single window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. 5 riders. They were silhouetted against the stark moonlight, sitting their horses just beyond his broken fence line. Scalp hunters. He could tell by the way they sat. The unofficial mix of army gear and buckskin, the cruel confidence. "He's in there," a gravelly voice said, loud enough to carry. Blood trail led straight to this dung heap, in one smooth motion. Caleb crossed the room and blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into near total darkness. The faint, silvery light from the window was all that remained. "Get up," he hissed, moving to the cot where he'd made Nayeli as comfortable as possible. "Both of you, now!" Tala was already on her feet, her knife in her hand, her body tensed. "They are here. I will fight." "You will die," Caleb snapped, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He grabbed Nayeli's blanket. "She cannot stand, and I will not be butchered in my own home because you are too proud to be smart. There is a cellar, under the rug." He kicked back the worn bearskin rug, revealing a heavy, square-cut trap-door with a rope handle. He heaved it open, revealing a black square that smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. "Get in, both of you." Tala's face was a mask of fury. "I will not hide in a hole like a rat. This ain't about you." Caleb grabbed her arm, his hand closed on solid, unyielding muscle. "It's about her." He pointed to Nayeli, who was struggling to sit, her face pale with pain and fear. "She is in no condition to fight. Neither am I. Not against 5. Now, get in the goddamned hole, or you have killed her as surely as they will." The logic, brutal and cold, broke through her warrior's pride. Tala's expression hardened into something else, a calculated, cold rage. With a grunt, she scooped Nayeli up into her arms. The display of strength, even from a wounded woman carrying one larger than herself, made Caleb's breath catch. Tala disappeared down the steps, a shadow swallowing shadows. "Stay silent," Caleb whispered down to her. "No matter what you hear, do you understand me?" He received only a glittering-eyed stare from the darkness. He shut the heavy door, the sound a dull, final thump. He kicked the rug back over it, smoothing the edge just as a heavy boot slammed against the cabin door. "Hey, rancher, we know you're in there. Open up, or we burn it down with you in it." Caleb took a deep, steadying breath. He ran a hand through his hair, mussing it. He worked a yawn into his face. He picked up his rifle, a Winchester, and jacked around into the chamber, the sh-sh sound loud in the small room. Then, holding it loosely at his side, he walked to the door and lifted the bar. He opened it just a crack, squinting. "Who in the hell are you waking a man in the middle of the night?" The man who had laughed was standing on his porch. He was tall, greasy-haired, and wore a cavalry jacket that was missing its insignias. He smelled of cheap whiskey and unwashed flesh. He pushed the door open, forcing Caleb to stumble back. The other 4 dismounted, fanning out in the yard. "Ain't you a cozy one?" the leader sneered, his eyes scanning the dark, simple room. "We're a posse, friend, from Fort Horizon, Major Pike's men." "A posse?" Caleb leaned on his rifle, feigning sleepiness. "What's the trouble? I ain't seen trouble out here since, well, ever. The trouble. the man said, stepping fully inside. "Is a pair of Apache, big ones, a couple of giant bitches who killed 2 of our men. We tracked them this far. Their blood trail ends right on your doorstep. Rancher." "Blood," Caleb put a quiver in his voice. "Lord, no, just me, my livestock, that's all. Been alone for 2 years." The leader's eyes fell on the cot. It was neatly made, but the blanket was the one Caleb had given Nayeli. "That's a small cot," the man said, his voice dropping. "But the blanket, it looks like it's been used by more than one." He then saw the table. 2 tin plates, stained with bean gravy. "You expecting company or just a mighty hungry man?" "I make extra," Caleb stammered. "Saves on cooking." "Search the place," the leader barked to his men. "Check the barn, the stalls, everywhere." 2 of the men, rifles ready, headed for the barn. A third circled the house. The leader stayed, his eyes fixed on Caleb. "And you stay right here, unless you got something to hide." "Nothing to hide," Caleb said, his heart a cold hammer in his chest. "Just don't spook the horses." From beneath the floorboards, Tala heard the heavy, scraping footsteps of the men walking toward the barn. She heard the creak of the barn door. She pulled her sister closer in the pitch-black, earthy-smelling hole. Nayeli was shivering, her breathing coming in small, pained gasps. Tala leaned her mouth close to her sister's ear, whispering in the rapid, guttural cadence of their Apache dialect. "Do not be afraid, little sister. If they find us, if they lift that door, I will not let them take you. I will kill the first one. I will take his gun. I will die here. But I will take 3 of them with me. I swear it on our mother's grave." Nayeli just clutched Tala's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. The 4th man, the one who had circled the cabin, came back inside. "Nothing out back, boss, just a woodpile." "And the barn," the leader called out. A voice shouted back from the darkness. "Nothing, just a bay horse and some empty stalls." The leader grunted, his gaze falling on the bearskin rug. It was a suspicion, nothing more, a hunter's instinct. He nudged it with his boot. "What's this?" he said, tapping the trap door. "Root cellar." "Potatoes," Caleb said, his voice tightening. Just potatoes. I love potatoes," the man sneered. He bent down and grabbed the rope handle. "Let's have a look." He heaved. The door, heavy and damp, was sluggish. The moment a sliver of gray moonlight cut into the darkness of the cellar, Tala moved. She did not climb out. She exploded, like a cornered mountain cat. She launched herself upward, her entire body coiled. She grabbed the bounty hunter, a big man, by his jacket and his throat. The man, caught off guard, leaning over, had no leverage. Tala's strength was absolute. She yanked him off his feet and down into the cellar, his head cracking hard against the edge of the opening as he fell. He landed in a heap on the dirt floor, the air knocked from him, before he could even gasp. Tala was on him. Her powerful arm was a bar across his windpipe, silencing any cry. Her other hand, holding her long, heavy-bladed knife, was pressed against his throat. He bucked and thrashed, but it was like being pinned by a fallen horse. Above, Caleb heard the thud and the muffled crash. The leader, his back to the hole, had turned toward the sound. "What in the—" Caleb did not hesitate. He raised his Winchester and fired it straight into the air, through the roof. The explosion of the shot in the small cabin was deafening. Plaster and splinters rained down. "Snake!" Caleb yelled, his voice cracking with convincing panic. "Damn it! A big rattler! By the stove, I missed it!" He racked the rifle, ejecting the shell, his eyes wild. The sound of the shot, the yell, the chaos, it covered everything. The 2 men from the barn came running, their rifles up. "What is it? What happened?" "A snake," Caleb said, breathing hard. "Damn near took my foot off. It went under the cot." "You're a mess, old man." One of the men laughed, relieved. "Shooting at shadows." "Boss," the other one called, looking at the leader, who was still peering into the now silent cellar. "Jed, are you there?" The leader, annoyed by the interruption, turned back to the cellar. "Jed, what are you doing down there?" There was no answer. A moment of pure, cold silence stretched. The leader knew. Caleb knew. The men in the yard knew. The game was over. "He's in there," the leader whispered, his hand dropping to his pistol. "He's got him in the cellar." He turned to Caleb, his face a mask of murderous realization. You son of a—" Caleb did not let him finish. He swung the heavy butt of the Winchester in a tight, brutal arc, a move he had learned in a dozen brawls. It connected with the leader's temple with the sound of a split log. The man dropped without a sound. The two men by the door opened fire. The cabin exploded. Bullets tore through the table, shattering the coffee pot. Caleb dived behind the overturned table, firing his revolver. Not to hit, but to make them take cover. "Tala!" he roared. "The side door go!" He did not know if there was a side door to the cellar, but it did not matter. From the yard, the fifth man, the lookout, started firing into the cabin. "Jed's dead!" one of the men yelled. "He's got him in there! Kill the bastard!" A shadow moved at the cellar opening. Tala rose from the hole. She was not running. She was carrying the dead man's rifle and his pistol belt. She tossed the rifle to Caleb. "Two," she said, her voice calm in the chaos. "By the barn!" A man charged the porch, firing his pistol wildly. Tala, moving with a speed that defied her size, met him at the door. She did not shoot. She hit him with her shoulder. A low, powerful tackle that snapped his ribs and sent him flying backward off the porch. He landed in a heap and did not move. Caleb, now armed with the new rifle, took aim at the last man, the one reloading by the barn wall. He did not have to shoot. The man saw his partner go down. He saw the giant Apache woman emerge from the cabin like a demon. He saw Caleb, no longer a sleepy rancher, but a deadly-eyed veteran. The man dropped his rifle. He scrambled for his horse, mounted in a panic, and spurred the animal hard, disappearing into the darkness, riding hell for leather back toward Fort Horizon. The silence that fell was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was filled with the smell of gunpowder, spilled whiskey, and fresh blood. Caleb stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. His hands, he noted with a strange detachment, were shaking. His shirt was sticky with blood, some his from a graze on his arm, but mostly theirs. Tala stepped off the porch. She walked to the man she had tackled, nudged him with her boot. He was dead or dying. She took his weapons. Then she turned back to Caleb. She walked straight up to him, her face unreadable in the moonlight. She stood so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. Before he could speak, she grabbed the front of his bloody shirt, her fist bunching the material, pulling him toward her until their faces were inches apart. "You chose!" she hissed, her voice low and vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "You shot at them. You stood with us." Her grip was iron. He did not, or could not, pull away. "There is no going back," she said. "From this night, your life is not your own. You are Red Mesa business. You understand? White man." He was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark, furious eyes. He could feel her hot, quick breath on his face, smell the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder and the clean, animal scent of her sweat. His heart was hammering against his ribs, pounding a rhythm that was not just fear, not just adrenaline. It was something new, something terrifyingly alive. He did not answer. He just held her stare. Slowly, as if realizing what she was doing, she released his shirt, shoving him back half a step. "From the cellar," a weak voice called. "Tala." Tala's body visibly softened, the killer receding, the sister returning. She turned and went back to the cellar, disappearing into the earth to retrieve her sister. Caleb watched her go. Then slowly, painfully, he went to check on the men. The leader was dead. The one Tala had tackled was dead. The one in the cellar was dead. 3 dead. 1 escaped. He dragged them, one by one, to the barn. This was not a night for burying. He helped Tala get Nayeli out of the cellar and onto the cot inside the cabin, the cot that was now stained with blood. He lit the lamp, and the room was a hellscape of splintered wood and shattered glass. Nayeli, despite the chaos, looked better. Her eyes were clear. She was weak, but the fire was returning. She reached out and her large, strong hand closed weakly around Caleb's wrist. "He will go back," she whispered, her voice a thin thread. "The one who ran. He will tell Pike." "I know," Caleb said, his voice numb. "They will not give up." Nayeli continued, her grip tightening. "And you the one who fed us, by the old law. The law of the seed, a life given must be paid. You saved us. You fought for us. You now carry a blood debt to the entire tribe." Caleb looked from her earnest, solemn face to Tala, who was standing by the door, reloading the pistol she had taken. He did not understand what blood debt meant. He only understood that his life, the quiet, empty, solitary life he had built, was over. He stepped outside onto the porch, the rifle heavy in his lap. He sat on the top step, the same spot the bounty hunter had died. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He looked out toward the east, toward the dark, jagged line of the Red Mesa Mountains. He stared so hard, his eyes ached. He thought he saw them, or maybe he just willed them into being. Tiny, pinprick lights, far away on the horizon, like distant stars that had fallen to earth. Campfires, or just an illusion, born of a mind strained to its breaking point. He did not know. He did not know that the fires were real. He did not know that the news of Pike's raid and the disappearance of the chief's daughters had already reached the Red Mesa. He sat there, a lone man on a bloody porch, completely unaware that 700 Apache riders were already moving. A silent, vengeful wave in the dark, and they were riding for him. He was jolted awake not by a sound, but by the earth itself. He had not slept, not really, just drifted in a state of armed exhaustion on the porch steps. His rifle across his knees, the vibration came first, a low, steady thrum through the soles of his boots, up through the wood, and into his bones. It felt like a distant, rolling earthquake. Then came the sound, carried on the thin, gray air of dawn. It was the beat of a drum, low and funereal, a single, deep note that measured the pulse of the land, and beneath it, a noise like a faraway ocean, a rhythmic, thundering crash that was not water, but hooves. Hundreds of them, perhaps 1,000. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He grabbed his rifle, his mouth paper dry. He had thought of the rider who escaped. He had expected a patrol, 10 men, maybe 20. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the blood-soaked dirt from the previous night. He looked east, toward the rising sun. The horizon was gone. It was not the sun that blocked the sky. It was a living dark tide of men on horseback, a flood of riders pouring over the low ridges, not fast, but with the unstoppable, deliberate pace of a glacier. They were an ocean of painted ponies, feathered lances, and grim-faced riders. They did not charge. They flowed. In the space of 5 minutes, the Rourke Ranch ceased to be a solitary patch of land and became the epicenter of the world. The riders split, forming perfect concentric circles around the small cabin. The outermost circle was a wide, restless ring of younger riders, their horses stamping and blowing. The next circle was tighter, filled with veteran warriors, their faces grim, their weapons held ready. The inner circle was composed of older men, chiefs and advisors, their horses as still as stone. Caleb's scout's eye, an instinct he could not shut off, automatically counted. There were, he estimated, at least 700 warriors, their faces painted in the stark red and black patterns of war. Feathers fluttered from lances and braided hair. Bows were strung. Rifles, old army carbines mixed with newer models, rested across their laps. The morning sun, just clearing the mesa, struck the metal of their weapons, the silver conchos on their bridles, setting the entire prairie ablaze with sharp, dangerous glints of light. His small cabin, his broken fence, his leaning barn. They looked like a child's toys dropped in the center of a volcano. From the inner circle, 2 figures emerged. They rode forward slowly, their horses' hooves muffled by the grass. They stopped just yards from Caleb's porch. The man was tall, perhaps in his middle years, with a frame that was lean but immensely powerful. He sat his horse with an unnatural, rigid stillness. His face was a map of hard lines, his expression carved from stone, his eyes as cold and unmoving as chips of black obsidian. This was a man who had made decisions of life and death until they no longer weighed on him. Beside him rode a woman. She was ancient, thin as a dried cornstalk, her skin a network of deep wrinkles, but her eyes were far from old. They were sharp, black, and unsettlingly bright. They seemed to see not just Caleb, but the air around him, the ghosts at his back, the blood on his porch. This was Mother Luyana, the shaman, the voice of the spirits. Caleb knew, without a word being spoken, that he was looking at Chief Dasan. The cabin door creaked open. Tala stepped out. She did not look at Caleb. She moved past him, her head held high, and stood on the ground between him and the chiefs. She was still in her bloodied buckskin, but she stood as a warrior, unbowed, her gaze fixed on her father. Behind her, Nayeli appeared in the doorway. She was heavily bandaged, her face pale, but she had managed to pull herself upright. She leaned against the door frame, her great height making her visible to all. When the 700 warriors saw them, when they saw the giant sisters of Red Mesa, their shield sisters. Alive, a sound swept through the circles. It was not a cheer. It was a deep, collective murmur, a sibilant hiss of air drawn through 700 mouths at once. The relief was palpable, but it was edged with a deep, simmering anger. Chief Dasan raised his hand. The murmur died instantly. The silence that fell was absolute, heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. He looked not at his daughters, but at Caleb. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the yard as if he were speaking to each man individually. "I am Dasan," he declared. "You stand on Red Mesa land, though you have put a white man's fence on it." He paused, his stone-like eyes taking in the bloodstains, the broken porch, the dead men Caleb had dragged into the barn. "You, white man, you have taken my daughters into your home." Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle. His knuckles were white. He expected the order. He expected the first arrow. He was ready to die. "The warriors of the Red Mesa know the law." Dasan continued, his voice resonating like a drum. "The old law, the law of the 8 colonels. It states that any outsider, any enemy, who gives food and water to the shield sisters when they are broken and bleeding, who gives them shelter, that man becomes Atisikos, the blood debtor." Caleb stared, completely bewildered. He had expected to be scalped for touching them, for harboring them, for being a white man in the wrong place. This was something else entirely. This was a ritual. Dasan leaned forward slightly on his horse, his gaze pinning Caleb to the porch. "You fed them. You put your white man's hands on their hunger, on their survival. From that moment, your fate was no longer your own. It belongs to the Red Mesa. It is tied to them until the debt is paid." He looked at the dead men by the barn. Paid in blood or paid in life. The old woman, Mother Luyana, urged her horse a step closer, her sharp eyes fixed on Caleb, and he felt as if his skin were being peeled back. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves, but it cut through the air. "It was foretold," she chanted, her gaze distant, looking at something over Caleb's shoulder. The grandfathers spoke of it. A day would come when the sisters, shields of the people, would fall in the sand. A day would come when they would take bread and water from the hands of a white man, a man who carries the shadow of our people's burned lodges on his back. Caleb flinched. It was as if she had reached into his mind and pulled out his darkest secret. "The prophecy said," Luyana continued, her voice rising, "that when this man fed them, 700 riders would come. They would surround his house. And in that house, the council would meet to decide. To decide if we burn the house and the man within it, or if that house will become a bridge between 2 worlds. She pointed a thin, trembling finger at the cabin. "This is the house, and you are the man." Tala took 1 step forward and dropped to one knee in the dirt, her head bowed to her father. My father, she said, her voice thick but strong. Do not kill this man. He was not what we thought. When we were nothing, he gave us his last bread. He gave us his water. When I was ready to die, he looked at Nayeli, and he saw life. She paused, struggling with the words, her pride fighting her honesty. Last night, the bounty hunters came, Pike's men. This man did not give us up. He shot at his own kind. He killed them. He stood with us. He tells the truth, Nayeli called out from the doorway. Her voice was weak, but carried in the stillness. She was shaking. Whether from fever or fear, Caleb could not tell. Father, he is the reason I live. The bullet was deep. He took it out. She then pushed herself away from the doorframe, her face contorting in a mask of sudden, terrible rage. It was Pike Major Harlan Pike. And the traitor, Ellis Crow. They led the soldiers to the winter camp. Her voice broke in a sob of pure fury. They shot the children as they ran in the back. They shot them in the back. The name Pike was like a spark in a powder keg. A low, violent sound erupted from the 700 warriors. It was not a yell. It was a growl. A promise of death that rippled through the ranks. Lances were raised, horses stamped, sensing the collective rage of their riders. The circle tightened by a foot. The air suddenly compressed and volatile. Chief Dasan raised his hand again. The sound cut off, but the rage remained. A simmering, visible thing. He looked at Caleb, his expression unreadable. Pike, he said, the name a curse. Our scouts report the same. The one who ran back to Fort Horizon told his story. Pike is not waiting for a full army. He gathers his hunters and the soldiers who follow him. He rides back, seeking to finish what he started, seeking to kill my daughters. Dasan's gaze was heavy, a physical weight. This changes things. The debt is complicated. My daughter's life against your past. Your actions last night against the soldier you were. He made his decision. We will not judge you yet. You will be brought before the Council of Elders, here on this ground, under the laws of war. But first, we deal with the butcher, Pike. We must know where he rides. Caleb stood frozen on his porch. He looked around. His yard was no longer his. It was a massive, armed camp. Warriors were dismounting. Horses were being watered at his trough, which was already running dry. Small, temporary shelters were being erected. Women and children who had ridden in the rear of the column were already starting cook fires, their movements efficient and practiced. The Rourke Ranch, his refuge, his tomb of silence and memory, had vanished. In its place stood a courtroom, a military command post, and the capital of the Red Mesa Nation. He was a prisoner, a debtor, and, perhaps, their only white-skinned ally, all at the same time. His isolation was over. The war had come home. The sun was an hour high, and the day's heat was already a physical weight. The 700 warriors had dismounted, forming a vast, breathing wall of humanity that encircled the ranch yard. The 3 dead bounty hunters were gone, dragged into the barn, their presence a stain that had been momentarily covered. In the center of the yard, the spot where Caleb had faced the men last night, a space was cleared. The inner circle of elders, a dozen men whose faces were maps of sun and time, sat on the ground, their expressions as hard and ungiving as the earth itself. Chief Dasan stood at their head, with Mother Luyana beside him. 2 warriors, tall and bearing the scars of past fights, walked to the cabin. They did not touch their weapons. They simply motioned for Caleb to come out. He stepped from the porch, his hands empty. He had washed the blood from his skin, but his shirt was still stained dark. He was not bound. His rifle and pistol had been left inside. He walked with his head high, a man who had already made peace with one kind of death and was not yet sure what to make of this new one. They led him to the center of the circle and left him standing alone. He could feel the collective gaze of 700 men upon him. It was not a physical pressure, but a spiritual one, a weight of judgment that threatened to crush his bones. Mother Luyana stepped forward. She carried a single eagle feather. She held it up, and the restless shifting of the crowd ceased. The man who stands here, she began, her reedy voice cutting through the silence. He is 2 men. He is the Yuda, the white-skinned soldier who rode with the butcher Pike. He is the man who brought the burning stick to the lodges of our cousins." She turned, her black eyes pinning Caleb. "And he is the man who gave bread to the daughters of our chief. He is the man who fought his own kind to protect them. The soldier and the savior. These two men cannot live in the same skin. The lie will poison the body." Her eyes bored into him. "We demand the truth, not the white man's truth, which changes with the wind. We demand the D-ye, the whole truth. Why does the wolf guard the fawn speak, and speak only truth? For 700 warriors will hear the lie in your throat." Caleb's mouth was dry. He looked at Dasan, whose face was stone. He looked at Tala, who stood near the porch, her arms crossed, her expression a furious, unreadable mask. He looked at Nayeli, who watched him with a painful, desperate hope. He knew in that moment that any lie, any half-truth, would be a coward's death. He had been a coward once. He would not be one again. He took a breath and spoke, his voice hoarse but carrying. "I rode with Pike." The admission hung in the air. A poisonous thing. A murmur of anger rose from the outer circle. "I was a scout," Caleb continued, his eyes fixed on a point in the dust. "A year ago, we were on patrol, and we found a village. Major Pike gave the order." He stopped, his throat closing. He was not in the yard. He was back in the smoke, the heat, the screams. He gave the order to clear it. "We set the torches. We were told it was empty." His voice dropped to a whisper, a confession not meant for 700, but for himself. "It was not empty. I was at the last lodge. The torch was already in the hide, and I heard it. I heard a child crying." A gasp went up from some of the women in the crowd. Caleb's face was pale, slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the morning heat. "I did nothing," he choked out. "I stood there. I listened. And I did nothing. I let it burn. The sound, it never stopped." He looked up, his eyes meeting Dasan's, and his gaze was that of a damned man. "I deserted that night. I took my pay and I walked until I could not hear the horses anymore. I bought this ranch. I came here to be alone. I came here to hide from that sound." The circle was utterly silent, the warriors frozen by the rawness of his confession. "When I found your daughters on the trail," he said, his voice stronger, "my first thought, the truth you asked for my first thought, was for myself. I saw them, dying, and I thought, not again. I thought I cannot have 2 more ghosts in this house. I did not want more sounds to haunt me in the night." He looked at Tala. "My motive was selfish. It was guilt. It was cowardice." He paused, then went on. "But that it changed. In the barn, when I was cleaning her sister's wound," he pointed to Nayeli. "The medic in me, the man I was before the soldier it took over. I was not looking at an Apache. I was looking at a bullet, a rib, and a life bleeding into the straw. And I saw Tala, standing guard, willing to fight the entire world with a spear for her sister. It stopped being about my sin. It became about her life, about their lives. That is the truth. All of it." He finished, his chest heaving, the confession leaving him empty and exposed. A long silence followed. Then, a tall, scarred warrior in the inner circle stood up. This was Chaitan, a war leader, his face a landscape of hard-won battles. "The white man's confession is interesting," Chaitan said, his voice a deep growl. "He speaks of his guilty soul. But what is a soul to us? What is his guilt to a child in a burning lodge? The law is the law. His motives do not matter. His actions are what bind him. He fed the Shield sisters. He fought for them. He has willingly, or foolishly, tied his rope to our wagon. Now the rope is tangled. We must either cut him free," he drew his knife and made a slicing motion, "or he must be pulled into our circle and made useful. His life for his guilt. That is not our way. His life as a tool for the people. That is the law. He must be a slave, or he must be a weapon." The murmur of agreement was strong. A weapon, or death. Before Dasan could speak, Nayeli's voice, surprisingly strong, cut through the air. "Chaitan speaks of the law, then let the law be balanced." She was standing now, holding onto the porch rail, Tala's hand on her back, supporting her. He says this man's life is owed. I say it is. It is owed to us, to me, and my sister. Her eyes swept the crowd. If his life must be paid, let him pay it. Let him pay it to the man who caused this pike. She pointed at Caleb. He rode with Pike as a coward. Let him ride against Pike as a man. Let him use what he knows, not for his own guilt, but for our justice. Let him stand in battle with the people he once betrayed. Let him die there, if the spirits will it. But let his debt be paid fighting our fight. The logic was sharp, and it resonated with the crowd. Mother Luyana, who had been listening with her eyes closed, now opened them. She nodded slowly. The girl speaks with wisdom, she chanted. The debt is not to the dead, the debt is to the living. The council has one path, the law has another, but the spirits they offer a third way, one that has been forgotten for a generation. For no outsider has ever been worthy to walk it. She stepped closer to Caleb. It is the Kay Bida Ati, the blood brothers' trial. It is not a path to service or to slavery. It is a path to becoming, if you accept, you will not ride for us. You will ride as one of us. You will lead the warriors to the place where Pike will come. You will use your soldiers' knowledge to hunt your own. You will fight at the head of the charge, with Chaitin at your side to watch you. You will not flinch. You will not run. She looked at Dasan. And if he lives, if he fights with the heart of a red mesa, Chief Dasan spoke, his voice the final, heavy stone. If you survive, he said to Caleb. If you prove your courage and your loyalty are not just white man's words, the council will meet again. We will consider washing the blood debt. We will consider breaking the law and making you Kai, a blood brother. The first white man to ever carry the name. The silence was absolute. The honor was unthinkable. The risk was total. Tala, who had been a statue of fury, suddenly broke. Her hands shot out, grabbed Caleb's arm in a bruising grip, and she physically dragged him from the circle. She hauled him to the corner of the barn, out of the direct line of sight of her father, her face a storm. "You fool!" she hissed, her voice a low, desperate snarl. She was shaking. "You do not say yes. Do you hear me? This is not a game. This is not for your broken soul. This is a test. Chaitin will watch you. He hates you. He will send you into the first bullet. They will all watch you. And if you die... She stopped, her throat working. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "If you die?" she whispered, the anger gone, replaced by something he could not name, something that sounded almost like fear. "The debt, the one you made when you gave us bread. It will fall on me, the one who brought this curse to my people, the one who let you live. I will carry the guilt of your death." Caleb looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a giant, not as a warrior, but as a woman terrified of losing something else. He slowly, gently, covered her hand with his own, the hand that was still crushing his arm. "Tala," he said, his voice quiet. He had never used her name before. She flinched, but did not pull away. "I have been dead since I lost my family," he said. "I have been a ghost, hiding in this house, hiding from the sound of a child. Your sister, you are the first living things I have cared about in 2 years. I have been half dead for a long time." He looked past her, at the circle of men, at Dasan, waiting. "I would rather die for good, for something, than live as that ghost anymore. Either I die for good, or I live as someone else after this." He gently pried her fingers from his arm, but he held her hand for a second longer. Then he let go, and turned. He walked back. He did not stop at the edge of the circle, but walked straight into the center, his boots firm on the hard-packed earth. He did not look at Luyana, or the elders. He walked until he stood directly before Chief Dasan, close enough to see the lines of grief and war around the man's eyes. Caleb met his unblinking, obsidian stare. "I accept," Caleb said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried to every corner of the yard. "I accept the blood brothers' trial." A single beat of silence hung in the air. Then, Chaitin, The war leader stood. He lifted his heavy, stone-tipped war lance and slammed the wooden butt onto the ground. Thud. The sound was as final as a gavel. Another warrior, then another, copied the motion. Thud. Thud. Within seconds, all 700 warriors, mounted and on foot, were pounding the earth. They beat their lances, the butts of their rifles, their closed fists against their chests, in a single, deafening, rhythmic beat. It was not a cheer. It was the sound of a heart. It was the sound of a forge. It was the sound of a verdict, passed and accepted. The afternoon sun settled over the Rourke Ranch, but the place was unrecognizable. The silence Caleb had cultivated for 2 years was gone, replaced by the thrum of a nation gathering for war. His desolate yard was now a sprawling, living encampment. Hundreds of ponies were picketed on his grazing land. Women tended to cook fires, the smoke rising in a dozen columns, the smell of roasting meat and herbs mingling with the dust. Children, who had been silent and wide-eyed upon arrival, now chased each other in shrieking games between the horses, their laughter a sound Caleb had not heard on this land since his own son was alive. The warriors were a study in deadly purpose. They sat in small groups, the metallic shing-shing of whetstones on steel blades providing a constant, sharp rhythm. They fletched arrows, restrung bows, and meticulously cleaned their rifles. The air was thick with purpose, with anticipation, with a collective, controlled rage that was focused on the battle to come. Caleb was a stranger in his own home. He had been given his orders not by Dasan, but by Chaitan, the scarred war leader whose eyes never left him. His task was simple: prepare the armory. His small, leaning barn was to be the staging ground for the strike. He was not alone. Tala was there. She had been assigned to the same duty, whether it was to help him or to guard him. He did not know. The air between them was thicker than the dusty gloom of the barn. It was heavy with the words from the trial, with his confession, with his acceptance of the trial. It was taut as a bowstring, vibrating with 1,000 unsaid things. He worked at one end, she at the other. He counted out the boxes of cartridges he had hoarded, stacking the small .44, 40 rounds for his Winchester. He had 3 boxes, just over 150 rounds. He had another 2 boxes of .45 Colt for his revolver. It was a pathetic arsenal for a war. Tala was checking the tack, not his, but the bridles and saddles taken from the dead bounty hunters. Her large, strong hands moved with an efficient, practiced grace, testing the leather for weaknesses, her fingers probing every buckle, every strap. She worked in a focused, angry silence. Caleb finished with the bullets and moved to his own saddle, picking up a frayed latigo strap, pretending it needed his full attention. The silence was too loud. He could hear her breathing, a steady, controlled rhythm. Finally, she spoke, her back still to him. Her voice was low, rough. "You could still go." He stopped working the leather. "Go where?" "In the night," she said, pulling a strap tight with a sharp grunt. "Take your horse, ride east, ride to the White Towns. They would not follow you there, not all of them." "And you?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Would you follow?" She turned then, her eyes flashing in the gloom. "I might, to put a knife in your back for a coward, or I do not know." She threw the bridle onto a hay bale. "Why did you say it to my father?" "Say what?" "I accept," she mocked him, her voice a low imitation of his own. "Why did you speak of this trial as if you were one of us? Why did you not just stay quiet? Let them decide." "They were deciding between slave and corpse, as I heard it," Caleb said, turning to face her fully. "I figured I'd try for a third way." "You are a fool," she said, but there was no heat in it, just a flat statement of fact. "You will be the first to die. Chaitan will see to it. You will ride at the front. You know what that means. I know what it means." She took a step closer, her shadow falling over him. "You could have run. Last night, when I told you to go, you could have saved your skin. Why?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. Did you say we when you spoke of the fight with Pike? Caleb looked down at the leather strap in his hands, then back up at her. Her face was inches from his, her eyes searching him, demanding an honesty he was not sure he possessed. Because, he said, his voice just as quiet, when I was out there, on the trail, when I had the canteen in one hand and that piece of bread in the other, I stopped being the man on the outside. I did not know it then, but I know it now. I made a choice. There is no them and me anymore. There is just what happens next. The anger in her expression faltered, replaced by a deep, aching confusion. She stared at him, her brows drawn together. You are not like them, she said, the admission torn from her. The soldiers, Pike, I have seen them. I saw them ride into our winter camp 2 years ago, when I was a girl. They laughed. Her voice cracked, just slightly, but she mastered it, the warrior's mask slamming back into place, but not before he had seen the pain behind it. I thought I would hate your kind until my bones were dust. I wanted to hate you. When you brought us here, I waited for the trap. I waited for the lie. And, he prompted. And, she continued, her voice dropping so low he had to strain to hear it. In the barn, last night, when you were working on Nayeli, your hands. She looked at his hands, which were now stained with grease and dirt. They were shaking. When you argued with me, they were shaking with anger. But when you touched my sister, when you cut her, your hands were steady. She looked up, her eyes bright with an unshed, angry moisture. You were afraid of hurting her. I saw it. A white man, a soldier, afraid of causing pain to an Apache. That image, it will not leave my head. It makes my hatred, it is not black anymore. It is gray, and I do not know what to do with it. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the cracks in the barn wall. It made the single oil lamp he had lit on a barrel flicker, sending their shadows dancing, large and distorted, against the stalls. He stood there, absorbing her confession. He saw the tension in her body, the way her hands were clenched at her sides, the muscles in her neck and shoulders rigid, as if holding herself together by sheer force of will. He took a half-step closer. He could see, in the flickering light, the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. And he saw the scars. He had seen them before, but not like this, not as blemishes, but as part of her story. A long, thin, silvery line ran from her jawline down her neck, disappearing into the collar of her buckskin shirt. Another, wider and puckered, crossed her forearm. Without thinking, driven by an impulse he could not name, he lifted his hand, slowly, so as not to startle her. He reached out. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed the scar on her arm. He traced it, a light, questioning touch, as if reading a story written in a language he did not know. Her reaction was instant. Her hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Her grip was not a touch. It was a vice. It was the same strength that had pulled a man into the cellar, the same strength that had tackled another to his death. Her eyes blazed, a warning, a promise of violence. "Do not," she hissed. He did not pull away. He did not flinch. He just met her gaze, his own hand still resting against her scarred skin, trapped beneath her grip. He watched her. He watched the war in her eyes. The grip, which had been tight enough to break bone, did not release, but it changed. The pressure eased. It went from a threat to a tether. It was no longer a strike to push him away, but a hold to keep him there, as if she was not sure what she wanted, only that she could not bear the thought of him letting go. Their eyes were locked. The space between them was electric. He could hear her breathing, short and shallow, no longer from anger, but from something else, something he felt in his own chest. A new storm, building in the suffocating quiet of the barn. "When I saw you last night," he said, his voice thick, hoarse. "After the fight, when you stood on the porch, covered in blood, ready to take on the whole world, and then again this morning when you pulled me aside so afraid I would die." He took a ragged breath. "I thought, that is a woman to stand with, From the moment I saw you on that fence, watching the stars, I knew, if I am going to die tomorrow, if Chayton sends me into that first bullet, I want to die standing in the same line as you." The admission hung in the air, raw and irrevocable. The last of her defenses crumbled. The tension in her body did not release. It shattered. With a sound, a low cry that was part anger, part grief, part need, she pulled him to her. Her hand on his wrist yanked him forward, while her other hand came up to grab the front of his shirt, the same way she had the night before. But this was not a threat. It was a collision. The last few inches of distance between them vanished. Her mouth was on his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a punishment. It was fierce, angry, desperate, a biting, claiming clash of teeth and lips. It was all the hatred she had felt, all the confusion, all the fear of the coming battle, poured into one violent, desperate act. He tasted the salt of her skin, the lingering iron of the blood from the night before, the clean, wild scent of her. He did not resist. He met her fury, his own desperation rising. His free hand came up, not to her waist, but to her face, his fingers burying themselves in her thick, dark hair. He held her head, kissing her back with a force that matched her own. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the anger broke, the fury dissipated, leaving something else in its wake. The kiss, which had been a battle, slowed. It softened. It became a desperate, clinging exploration. Her lips, which had been hard and bruising, became suddenly, shockingly soft, yielding, warm. Her hand, which had been fisted in his shirt, released its grip. Her large, powerful hand splayed open against his chest, as if feeling his heartbeat. Her other hand, the one still holding his wrist, slid up his arm, over his shoulder, to the back of his neck. Her fingers laced into his hair, and she held him fast. Not as a prisoner, but as a man she was terrified might disappear, might be an illusion. Caleb's arms, almost of their own accord, found their way around her. One hand settled on the strong column of her back. The other slid low, resting on the curve of her hip. He pulled her flush against him, and he felt the full length of her. She was tall, taller than most men he knew, solid with muscle, yet beneath the hard buckskin and the warrior's frame, she was warm, and she was leaning into him. She was, he realized with a shock, trembling. They stood locked together in the dusty light, their bodies pressed close, their mouths moving in a long, slow, deep kiss that was no longer about anger, but about a profound, shared, and starving need. It was a kiss that spoke of loss, of loneliness, of a shared understanding of death. It was the kiss of two people who had nothing left to lose and had, in the space of 2 days, found the only thing that mattered. He broke the kiss, but only slightly, their breaths mingling, hot and fast. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest. Or maybe it was his own. He could not tell them apart. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his voice shaking. "If one of us does not come back, at least I will know. I lived once. For real. Tonight." She did not answer with words. She just made a low sound in her throat and pulled his mouth back to hers, her grip tightening in his hair. They stayed that way for a long time, lost in a series of long, slow kisses that tasted of desperation and a fragile, new-found hope. The air was charged, the tension of their bodies undeniable, but it was a fire for warmth, not for consumption. The scene did not end in a tangle of limbs on the hay. It ended, much later, as the last light of day faded and the camp outside grew quiet. With the two of them sitting, they were not touching, except for their hands. They sat side by side on a bale of straw, their clothes perfectly intact. Their breathing finally slowed. His hand was holding hers, his fingers laced through hers. Her large, calloused hand, which had held a spear and a knife, now rested quietly in his outside. The distant, rhythmic beat of the war drums had faded as the camp settled for its last night of peace. The only sound in the barn was the whisper of the wind, and the loud, steady, synchronized beat of two hearts, finally in rhythm. making a silent promise for the battle that would come with the dawn. The dark had not yet begun to fade when the camp came alive. There was no bugle, no shouted order, only the silent, fluid movement of 700 warriors preparing to ride. The plan, devised in the night by Dasan, Chaitan, and the man they were now forced to trust, was in motion. The war party split, melting into the pre-dawn gloom in 3 separate, fast-moving columns, a living net designed to close around Harlan Pike. Caleb rode with the first. He was mounted on Old John, his Winchester in its scabbard, the borrowed rifle from the dead bounty hunter strapped to his back. He was a man marked, riding at the very head of the column. Beside him, grim and silent, rode Chaitan, the war leader's eyes a constant, suspicious weight. Behind them rode Tala. She moved with a liquid grace, her body, which had been pressed against his in the dark, now once again a warrior's, taut and ready. She had argued with her father, and lost. Naili was with them, the younger sister, her face pale but set in a mask of stubborn determination, rode a pony given to her by a young warrior. She was in no condition to fight, but she had refused to be left behind. "I will not hide," she had told Dasan, her voice weak but unbroken. "I will see the face of the traitor, Elias Crow. When he falls, I will see it." Dasan had relented. Now. Nayeli rode protected in the center of the elite war band, a living, wounded symbol of why they fought. They rode hard for 2 hours, the rising sun at their backs, pushing toward the jagged slit in the earth known as Crow's Spine Pass. It was the only way Pike's wagons, and especially his heavy Gatling gun, could get through the broken country. Caleb knew the pass. He had scouted it 6 times for the army. He knew its every twist, every blind corner, every killing floor. They arrived an hour before the sun was high enough to heat the rocks. Chaitan grunted. "Where?" Caleb dismounted, his body aching, his mind sharp and cold. He was back in his old skin, the scout skin, and it fit him with a grim familiarity. "Pike is arrogant, but not a fool," Caleb said, his voice low. "He'll send 2 scouts ahead. They'll check the high ground. Here." He pointed to the most obvious, wide ledges. "That is where he expects an ambush, so we do not put one there." He pointed high above, to a narrow, crumbling scree slope 100 yards into the pass. "The trap is here, at the narrowest point. When the lead wagon passes that white rock, we send the mountain down on it. It will block the pass. The rest of the column will be trapped, blind." He looked at the sheer cliffs. "Rifles are too slow, and the sound will warn them. We need archers. 50 on that rim, 50 on that one. A cloud of arrows, silent. They will not know where it comes from until it is too late." Chaitan stared at him, his suspicion warring with the cold, hard logic of the plan. He had expected a simple, brutal charge. This was elegant. This was a white man's trap. And the Gatling. "It cannot fire up," Caleb said. "By the time they unlimber it, the gunner will have 10 arrows in him." "He is the first target," Chaitan grunted, a sound that was almost approval. He turned and barked orders in Apache. The warriors, who had been watching Caleb with open hostility, now moved with a new, terrifying efficiency. They did not climb the cliffs. They flowed up them, disappearing like smoke into the rocks. They moved stones, balanced deadfalls, and in minutes, the pass was silent again. But it was a new, deadly silence. Tala had taken her position on the cliff face opposite Caleb, a high, precarious perch. She had her bow, before she disappeared. Her eyes met his across the canyon floor. There was no softness, no memory of the night. There was only the shared, grim understanding of the work to come. Caleb stayed on the canyon floor, hidden with Chaitan and 20 other warriors behind a jumble of boulders at the mouth of the pass. His job was to give the signal. His trial was to be at the front of the charge. They waited. The sun grew hot. The silence was absolute. Then, a distant rumble, the creak of wheels, the curses of men. They came, 2 scouts first, just as Caleb had predicted. They trotted into the pass, glanced at the obvious ledges, and, seeing nothing, waved the column on. The column was slow, arrogant. First came a dozen cavalry troopers, their blue uniforms covered in dust. Then, the first wagon, heavy with ammunition. Behind it, lumbering like a steel beast, was the wagon with the Gatling gun, its brass jacket gleaming. Behind that, 2 more wagons of supplies, and fanned out around them, a loose, disorderly group of 20 or more men, the scalp hunters, Pike's personal guard, their hats adorned with feathers, their faces bearded and cruel. Caleb saw him, Elias Crow, the Red Mesa trader, riding near the front, sharing a joke with Major Harlan Pike himself. Pike's face was flushed with confidence, his eyes already scanning the rocks, hungry for the slaughter he had come to finish. The column entered the trap. The lead wagon passed the white rock. The Gatling gun was just inside. The entire column was packed into the narrowest part of the pass, a perfect, inescapable bottleneck. Caleb looked at Chayton. Chayton nodded. Caleb raised his rifle high. He fired 1 shot straight into the air. The sound of the shot was swallowed by a deafening roar. The warriors above sent the rock slide down. Boulders the size of horses crashed onto the lead wagon, obliterating it in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. The pass was blocked. The column dissolved into chaos. Horses screamed and reared, trampling men. The cavalry troopers, trapped, drew their sabers, having no one to charge. "The gun!" Pike roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "Get the gun firing." The gunner and his assistant leaped to the Gatling, trying to swing its heavy barrels around and up before they could even touch the crank. A single arrow thudded into the gunner's throat. A second hit the assistant in the chest. They fell, dead before they hit the ground. Then came the black rain. From both sides of the cliff, a storm of arrows descended. There was no sound of gunfire, only the high, thin hiss of shafts and the wet, sickening thump as they found their targets. Men cried out, clutching at their chests, their necks, falling from their saddles. The scalp hunters, the brave men, panicked, firing their rifles wildly at the cliffs, their bullets ricocheting with harmless, whining sounds. Pike was a different breed. He was a soldier. "Defensive circle," he bellowed, dismounting, pulling men from their horses. "Wagons, get behind the wagons! Return fire at the cliffs! You cowards, fire!" His trained soldiers reacted. They formed a small, tight circle, using the dead horses and the remaining wagon as cover. They began to pour steady, disciplined rifle fire up at the cliffs. A warrior high above Caleb grunted, a spray of red mist erupting from his back. He toppled, falling 100 feet to the canyon floor. Another cried out, clutching a shattered arm. This was not a massacre. It was a battle. "Now!" Chayton roared. He rose from the boulders, and the 20 warriors with him rose, too. Caleb was at his side. They charged from the mouth of the pass, firing as they ran, closing the trap. The fight became a swirling, desperate melee in the smoke and dust. It was rifles, pistols, and then knives and clubs. Caleb fired his rifle until it was empty, then dropped it, drawing his revolver. He saw Tala on the canyon floor, a war club in one hand, a knife in the other, moving like a dark whirlwind. Her great strength a terrifying, deadly force. He lost sight of Pike, his only focus the man in front of him. Then he saw him. Elias Crow. The traitor had taken cover behind the last wagon, reloading his pistol. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror, and saw Caleb. A sneer of recognition twisted his face. "Rourke, the turncoat. I knew Pike was soft on you." He raised his pistol. "You like these red whores. You like being an Indian lover." He was not aiming at Caleb. He was aiming past him, at Tala, who was engaged with 2 other soldiers. "Let's see you beg when I put a bullet in her back." Caleb did not roar. He did not make a sound. The part of him that was a rancher, a husband, a medic, vanished. Only the killer remained. He dropped his empty pistol and lunged. Crossing the 10 feet between them in 2 bounds, he hit Elias low. A shoulder tackle that drove the air from the man's lungs and sent them both crashing into the dirt. Elias, though, was quick. He dropped his pistol and his knife was in his hand. He slashed upward, catching Caleb high on the arm. A long, burning cut. Caleb grunted, ignoring the pain. He grabbed Elias's wrist, the one with the knife. He saw the hatred in the traitor's eyes, the fear, the desperation. They rolled in the dust, two men locked in a primitive life-or-death struggle. Elias was strong, wiry, but Caleb's rage gave him a cold, focused strength. He got his other hand on Elias's wrist. He put his boot on the man's shoulder for leverage. He twisted. There was a wet, sickening snap. Elias screamed, his hand going limp. The knife dropped. Caleb snatched it. He pressed the man's own blade to his throat. Elias froze, his body rigid, his eyes white with terror. "Please," he whimpered. "Please, they paid me. Please." Caleb's vision was red. The sound of the child in the burning lodge filled his ears. He pressed the knife harder. "Caleb!" Tala's voice cut through his rage. He looked up. She was standing over him, her chest heaving, her face and arms spattered with blood that was not her own. He looked back at the whimpering man. This was not his justice. He stood, hauling Elias up by his shirt front. He shoved the man forward, sending him stumbling and falling at Tala's feet. "He is yours," Caleb panted, his arm dripping blood. Tala looked down at the man who had guided the soldiers to her home, the man who had caused the death of her people, the man who had laughed as children were shot. Her face was a mask of such pure, cold hatred that Elias began to sob. She raised her knife high, the sun glinting on the wet blade. The traitor closed his eyes, ready for the end. The moment stretched. Tala's arm trembled, not with weakness, but with the force of her rage. Then, with a low groan that came from her very soul, she spat on him. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "You do not get a warrior's death. You will be judged by the mothers. You will be judged by the widows." She kicked him, hard, in the ribs. "Chaitan, take this thing. Bind it." She had made her choice, not for blind revenge, but for justice. A shout from the end of the pass. "He is gone. Pike is gone." Caleb spun. A warrior was pointing. Major Harlan Pike, his blue jacket dark with blood on one shoulder, was galloping madly away on a lone horse, back toward Ash River. He had slipped through the chaos. At that exact moment, a final, stray shot from a dying soldier hit the rocks and whined across the pass. A Red Mesa boy, no older than 10, who had followed his father into the battle, cried out in fear. Naili, who had been on her pony nearby, reacted instantly. She threw her own body between the child and the sound. The bullet, spent and tumbling, struck her high on her wounded shoulder. A brutal, tearing impact. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and toppled sideways from the saddle. Caleb, his own arm burning, leaped. He caught her, his legs buckling under her solid weight, but he kept her from hitting the ground. He held her, his arm, the one Elias had cut, screaming in protest. The pass fell silent. The battle was over. The wagons were destroyed, the Gatling gun captured, the soldiers and hunters dead, captured or scattered. But Pike, like a wounded snake, was loose. Caleb gently lowered Nayeli, his blood mixing with hers on the bandages. He looked at Tala, who was rushing to her sister's side. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a cold, sick dread. Pike was not riding for help. He was riding for an army. He was riding back to Ash River to tell the story of a brutal, savage massacre of his men, led by a white traitor. Caleb looked down at the blood on his hands, then back at Tala. He knew, with absolute certainty, the next battle would not be here. It would be at his ranch, and it would not be a fight against soldiers, but a war for the truth, against the fear and hatred of an entire town. They rode back under a sky of bruised purple and gray. The victory at Crow's Spine Pass was a hollow, metallic thing. It tasted of ash. Nayeli was slumped over her pony, held in the saddle by a warrior, her new wound bleeding sluggishly through a hastily applied bandage. Caleb's own arm was a single, throbbing line of fire. They had won the battle, but the air was thick with the knowledge that the war had just begun. As they cleared the final rise, the one that overlooked his ranch, Caleb's heart stopped. His home was not as he had left it. It was occupied. A United States flag, the full 31 stars, had been rammed into the dirt yard, its pole a stark white line against the dark wood of his cabin. Gathered around it was a cluster of men, perhaps 30 or 40 townsfolk from Ash River, armed with shotguns, hunting rifles, and pitchforks. They looked nervous, their faces pale and angry. A mob waiting for a spark mixed among them, forming a more disciplined, if wary, line, were 24 blue-coated soldiers from Fort Horizon, and standing on his porch, as if he owned it, was Major Harlan Pike. His left arm was in a crude, bloody sling, his face the color of old parchment, but his voice was strong, full of venom and righteousness. He was preaching a full-scale massacre. I tell you, Pike's voice carried on the wind, sharp and clear. A coordinated attack by these heathen savages, and they were not alone. They were led, aided, and abetted by a traitor. A man who lived among you, Caleb Rourke. The Red Mesa column came to a halt on the ridge. 700 warriors, their faces painted, their lances still stained, their expressions grim. The posse in the yard turned. As one, they saw the ridge. They saw the army of Apache warriors looking down on them. A collective gasp, a wave of pure terror, swept through the townsfolk. Men fumbled with their weapons. The soldiers instinctively formed a line, their rifles snapping up. "See!" Pike roared, pointing, seizing the moment. "They come to finish the job, to burn you all out just as I said." The standoff was absolute. 3 armies, locked in a triangle of death. Chief Dasan and the Red Mesa warriors formed the outer circle, a silent, deadly crescent on the high ground, looking down. The terrified, angry posse and the disciplined but outnumbered soldiers formed the middle ring, their backs to the cabin, and in the center, caught between the hammer and the anvil, were Caleb, Tala, Chayton, and the lead warriors, who had ridden in first. No one fired. The silence was deafening, stretched thin as a wire. Every man knew the first shot would unleash a tide of blood that would drown the entire valley. A soldier, his uniform clean, his face young and etched with a terrible anxiety, stepped forward from the line of blue coats. "Hold your fire," he commanded, his voice high but steady. "I am Captain Evans, Fort Horizon. I am in command here. Hold your fire!" Pike shouldered past him, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "In command, Evans. You are a boy. I am the ranking officer, and I am telling you, this is an insurrection, that man." He pointed his good hand, a single, trembling finger, directly at Caleb. "Is a traitor, an inland pirate. He conspired with the enemy. He led them in an ambush, and he murdered United States soldiers. I saw it with my own eyes." A roar went up from the Ash River posse. "Hang him! Traitor! Get a rope!" Pike smiled, a thin, wolfish grin. He had them. "Captain, I'm ordering you to arrest that man for treason. He will be hanged from his own porch, as an example. And I want those two," he jabbed his finger toward Tala and Ayoli, "those savage murderers. I want them taken into military custody. For interrogation. Now." Caleb swung down from old John. His arm felt like it was on fire, but his mind was ice cold. He ignored the rifles trained on him, ignored Pike's screams. He walked, his boots crunching on the dirt, into the open space between the posse and his cabin. "He's right," Caleb said. The word stopped everyone. The posse went quiet. Pike's smile faltered. "I was there," Caleb continued, his voice clear and loud, carrying to the edges of the crowd. "I was at Crow's Spine Pass, and I was standing with the Red Mesa." "You hear it?" Pike shrieked. "He admits it, treason." "I admit to being there," Caleb said, his voice dropping, gaining a hard, dangerous edge. He turned, not to Pike, but to the townsfolk, to the men he had bought grain from, the women he had nodded to in the street. "He told you I led a massacre, but did he tell you why he was in that pass? Did he tell you he had a Gatling gun on that wagon? Did he tell you he was riding to finish the job he started 2 days ago, when he slaughtered the Red Mesa winter camp and shot women and children in the back?" a nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the story Pike had told. "This man," Caleb said, leveling his own finger at Pike, "is not a soldier. He is a butcher. He told you I murdered soldiers. He did not tell you his men were scalp hunters, riding for bounty, not for the flag. The Red Mesa did not attack. They defended themselves. They defended their homes from the man who burned them." "Lies!" Pike roared, his face turning a deep, mottled purple. "Slander from a man who has turned his back on his own kind." "Is it a lie?" Caleb called out, his voice ringing with a desperate, raw power. "Some of you were with him, were you not? 2 winters ago, the great victory at the Red Mesa winter camp." He scanned the crowd, his eyes locking on a woman in a faded black dress near the back. Mrs. Albright. Her husband had been on that patrol. He had come back with a bonus, bragging in the saloon for a week. Caleb looked at her. "He came here to tell you I'm a traitor. I'm going to tell you the truth. You want to know who Harlan Pike is, I can tell you. Because I was there too." The silence was now complete. Even Pike was stunned. "I was a scout. I followed his orders. He said the village was empty. He told us to clear it, to leave nothing." Caleb's voice was thick, the confession ripping itself from his throat. "I set fire to a lodge. I did as I was told, and then I heard it, a child, crying. Inside the lodge I had just set on fire. Mrs. Albright let out a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Her husband had died of fever 6 months later, raving about fire. She looked at Pike, her eyes wide with a new, sickening horror. The doubt was no longer a murmur. It was a visible, creeping thing. "That," Caleb said, his voice breaking, "is the man you are following. That is the honor he defends. I deserted the army that night. I came here to hide from that sound. I stood with the Red Mesa at that pass because, for the first time in my life, I was finally standing on the right side. I am not the traitor. He is." The standoff was absolute. The posse was frozen, their convictions shattered, their anger now confused, looking for a new target. Pike stood alone, exposed, his authority bleeding away faster than the blood from his arm. Tala dismounted. Her movement was fluid, powerful. The crowd flinched, rifles rising again. She ignored them. She walked past the line of soldiers, past Chayton, her face a mask of painted, impassive war. She was a terrifying, beautiful, and enormous figure of vengeance. She walked until she stood directly at Caleb's side. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, facing the posse, facing the soldiers. Then, slowly, in front of 700 warriors and the entire town of Ash River, she reached out. She took his bloody, bandaged left hand. She laced her fingers through his. The image was a bolt of lightning. The savage giant and the white traitor, their hands clasped, a single, unbroken line of defiance. It was a symbol more powerful than Pike's flag, more potent than Caleb's confession. It was an answer to the question of who stood with whom. Captain Evans saw it all. He saw Pike's ranting, his guilt. He saw Caleb's gut-wrenching confession, which rang with the undeniable truth of a man paying his dues. He saw the widow's face in the crowd, and he looked up at the ridge. He saw 700 warriors, organized, disciplined, holding their positions with the precision of a trained army, not a mob of savages. He was trapped. His orders were to protect these citizens. Firing on the Apache would mean the massacre of every man, woman, and child in this yard, including his own men. Siding with Pike meant siding with a monster. He made the only choice he could. "This," he announced, his voice firm, "is not a battlefield. It is a legal matter. There are accusations on both sides. Major Pike, you stand accused of atrocities. Mr. Rourke, you stand accused of treason." He looked from Dasan on the ridge to the posse in front of him. "I will not start a war here today. I am proposing a tribunal, a joint hearing, here, now. The citizens of Ash River will be the witnesses. The Red Mesa will provide their testimony. My men will ensure order. We will hear both sides, and we will find the truth. Not in blood, but in words." Pike saw it. His life, his career, his reputation. It was all dissolving. A trial with them as witnesses. He was a dead man. He had one bullet left to play. Chaos. A trial, he screamed, his voice a cracked, inhuman shriek. With heathens you are a traitor to Evans, a coward. All of you, there is only one way to speak to these dogs. His good hand snatched the revolver from his hip. He aimed it, not at Caleb, not at Evans, but at the biggest target, the symbol of the enemy's power. He aimed it at Chief Dasan on the ridge. It happened in the time it takes a heart to beat. A little boy, no more than 6 years old, the son of the town blacksmith, had wandered from his mother's skirt. He was standing in the open dirt, terrified by the shouting, frozen, looking at the horses. He was directly between Caleb and Pike. Pike fired. Tala did not think. She did not plan. She moved. She was not a warrior. She was not an Apache. She was a shield. With a roar, she lunged forward. She shoved Caleb back, hard, with one arm, spinning him out of the line of fire. Her other arm, her entire body, moved to cover the space where he had been. She saw the small, white child, frozen in terror. She used her own massive frame as a living wall, turning, twisting, and pulling the child against her leg, shielding him with her own body. The bullet, aimed for Dasan, flew wide, but it was not wide enough. It struck Tala high on the right shoulder, the same side that had been grazed before. The heavy-caliber slug ripped through the buckskin, tearing a long, bloody furrow across her flesh. It was not a mortal wound, but it was brutal. Blood exploded from the impact, a bright crimson spray that misted the air, that splattered onto her face, onto the dirt. Grunt. The sound was punched from her. Her body absorbed the shock, her knees buckling, but she did not fall. She stood, swaying, her teeth clenched in a grimace of pure agony. One hand pressed to her bleeding shoulder, the other still clamped protectively on the small, sobbing, white child who was clutching her leg. Silence. The world stopped. Every single person, the settlers from Ash River, the soldiers from Fort Horizon, the 700 Red Mesa warriors saw what just happened. They saw the savage, the murderer, the giant. They saw the Apache woman, without a moment's hesitation, take a bullet to protect a white child. The lie that Pike had built, the entire foundation of their fear and hatred, evaporated in that one silent, bloody moment. Caleb, stunned, looked at her. He saw the blood, the torn shirt, the pain, the child. He looked up, his gaze finding Pike, who stood alone, his smoking pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of utter, complete disbelief. Two lines of men faced each other, one under a flag, one under feathers. Between them, a bleeding woman, a crying child, and a man in the middle, caught, finally, in the terrible, cleansing light of the truth. The act had frozen time, the echo of Pike's shot, Tala's grunt of pain, the child's sharp, terrified wail. It all hung in the dead, hot air. Captain Evans was the first to find his voice. "Seize him!" he roared at his own men. Two soldiers, their faces white with shock and disgust, grabbed Major Pike, who was still staring at his smoking pistol, unable to process that his last, desperate act had failed so completely, sealing his own fate. "Get her inside," Caleb yelled, his voice raw. He moved to Tala, but she waved him off, her face tight with pain, her eyes blazing. "The trial," she gritted out, one hand clamped to her bleeding shoulder. "It is not finished." The blacksmith ran and scooped up his sobbing child, holding him close, his eyes fixed on Tala with a look of raw, uncomprehending gratitude. "She is right," Captain Evans said, his authority now absolute. Pike, disarmed and held, was shoved to the ground. "This farce is over, but the hearing is not—" The joint court began, not with legal arguments, but with pure, unvarnished truth. It was a tribunal held under the muzzles of 700 rifles and 24 carbines, on a patch of dirt stained with the blood of both sides. Mother Luyana spoke first. She called forward a Red Mesa woman whose face was a mask of grief. The woman spoke in her own tongue, her voice a low, rhythmic keen, while Naili, leaning on a warrior for support, translated. She told of the raid on the winter camp, of seeing her two young sons cut down by laughing men in mismatched blue coats. She did not weep. Her pain was too old, a cold, hard stone in her heart. Then Captain Evans, his face grim, called on Mrs. Albright. The widow, her hands trembling, stepped forward. She spoke of her husband, a good man, a farmer, who had been ambushed and killed at the Ash River train depot 2 years prior, his wagon set aflame. She spoke of the fear, the endless nights, the hatred she had felt for the savages who had taken him. The yard was silent. The Red Mesa listened to the white woman's loss. The settlers listened to the Apache woman's loss. The neat, clean lines of good and evil, of us and them, bled together, creating a muddied, terrible portrait of gray. It was a land that had been fed a steady diet of revenge, and everyone was starving. Pike, listening to this, his world collapsing, began to thrash. "You cannot do this," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You are listening to heathen lies, Evans. You are a fool. The army will hear of this. You will all be tried for treason, for consorting with the enemy." He saw he was convincing no one. His eyes, wild and desperate, scanned the crowd. "You cowards! You'll let these things dictate terms. We could end this right now. One good volley, and we could clear these savages from this land for good." The terror returned. He was pulling at the threads of fear that had held this town together for a decade. The Ash River posse gripped their shotguns tighter. A few of the younger soldiers, their discipline wavering, glanced at their captain. Fingers crept toward triggers. The air, which had been cleared by truth, thickened once more with the promise of a massacre. Caleb saw the moment. The fragile, impossible peace was about to shatter. He acted. He unbuckled his gun belt, the one he had taken from the dead bounty hunter. He let it fall into the dust with a heavy thud. He held his hands up, open and empty. Then he turned his back on Captain Evans, on the white faces of the posse, on the men of his own color. He turned his back completely and faced the 700 warriors on the ridge. He stood there for a long beat, his back a clear, vulnerable target. Then he turned around again. Slowly, he walked into the absolute center of the yard, into the no-man's land between the two armed camps. He stopped, his arms still held wide. "He's right about one thing," Caleb said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the deathly stillness. "Blood needs to be paid. There is a debt here, but it's not owed by them." He looked at Evans. "My sin is against you. I was a soldier, and I deserted my post. I stood against my own flag." Then he looked at Chief Dasan, a black shape against the sky. "And my sin is against you. I stood with the men who burned your homes. I was a coward, and my silence murdered your children. I have betrayed both sides." He lowered his hands and stood straight, a lone man, unarmed, in the center of a powder keg. "So, if you need to fire that volley," he said, his voice thick, "if you need to pull those triggers to save your honor, don't point them at each other. Point them at me. Take my life. It's the only one here that's truly forfeit." He closed his eyes. "Ready?" A dozen of the younger soldiers flinched. They looked away, shamefaced. "Misses." Albright let out a low sob. The raw courage of the act, a man offering his own life to stop the killing, was a thing no one could misinterpret. Captain Evans stared, his mouth open. He saw a path, a way out that was not soaked in blood. He found his voice, and it was the iron command of a true officer. "Stand down," he roared at his men. "Lower your weapons. That is an order. Stand down." The soldiers, visibly relieved, lowered their carbines. The posse, seeing the army stand down, uncertainly lowered their own shotguns. A collective breath was released. All but one. "Coward!" Pike screamed. He had been waiting for this. In the confusion, in the wave of emotion, he had twisted free from the grasp of the soldier holding him. He snatched the soldier's sidearm from its holster. "Pike, no!" Evans yelled. Pike raised the pistol. He aimed it straight at the center of Caleb's chest. "Caleb!" Tala's scream was a physical thing. She lunged, her wounded body moving with a speed born of pure, desperate instinct. She was too far to intercept, but her movement made Caleb react. He didn't duck. He turned. instinctively moving toward her voice. Pike fired. The world contracted to the sound of the shot. The bullet, meant for Caleb's heart, missed. It struck the heavy cottonwood porch post, the post Caleb himself had set in the ground. The lead slug hit the hard wood, whined, and ricocheted. It was a miracle of physics, a 1 in a million chance. The bullet, spent and deformed, flew back. Pike grunted, a sound of surprise, as if he had been punched. He looked down. A small dark hole had appeared in his chest. His own ricocheted bullet had struck him. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with a look of profound, idiotic surprise. He stumbled off the porch, falling backward into the dust, his pistol clattering on the stones. For a moment, he just lay there, blinking at the sky. Then, a thin line of red bubbled at his lips. Chayton let out a roar of triumph. It was not a sound of battle. It was a sound of pure, primal revenge. He leaped forward, his long knife in his hand. A dozen other Red Mesa warriors, their faces masks of joy and hatred, surged behind him, ready to tear the butcher of their people limb from limb. No! Caleb's voice was a cannon shot. He ran, his body interposing itself between the charging warriors and the fallen major. No, stop, Chayton! Stop, Chayton! His eyes red, his knife raised, skidded to a halt, inches from Caleb's face. Move, white man. He is ours. His blood belongs to us. You kill him like this, Caleb panted, his chest heaving, his hands up. And we prove him right. We prove we are the savages he told them we were. All of this, he gestured to the silent crowd. The soldiers. All of it means nothing. He looked Chayton in the eye, man to man. This is not the way. His blood is not enough. We need his name. We need his crime. He pointed at Captain Evans. Let the white man's own law call him a murderer. Let them hang him. Let them write it down in their books. That is how you win. Not with a knife. With the truth. Chayton's arm trembled. The desire for vengeance warring with the cold, hard logic of Caleb's words. He speaks the truth, my son. Chief Dasan had ridden forward, his horse stopping just behind Chayton. Mother Luyana was at his side. The old woman's eyes were fixed on Caleb, her expression unreadable. Dasan looked at Pike, who was now coughing, his life draining into the dirt. He will not live to see a white man's rope. It does not matter, Mother Luyana said, her voice quiet. The word is the weapon now, not the knife. A body rots and is forgotten. A word, written on their paper, lasts. It will be a shield for our children. He, she pointed at Pike, must be a symbol, not just a corpse. Dasan nodded. He looked at Captain Evans. You will take this man, but you will take him with our law. You will write down the testimony. All of it. The words of the Red Mesa woman. The words of the white trader. Rourke. And I, he stated, his voice ringing with a new, unheard-of authority, will sign my name to it as an equal party, as the one who brings the charge. This is the only way. Captain Evans looked at the dying major, at the 700 warriors, at the pale, shaken townsfolk. He was a man far beyond his depth, and he knew it. He was making history, and he hated it. I agree, Evans said, his voice hoarse. I will take him into custody. I will record all testimony. It will be sent to the Territorial Command, with your signature. 2 soldiers, their faces grim, hauled the gurgling, dying Pike to his feet and cuffed him. They threw him over a horse like a sack of grain. Mother Luyana turned her piercing gaze on Caleb. He stood, shaking, in the center of the yard, his sacrifice made, his bluff called. The blood debt for Pike, she said, her voice carrying, has been placed on the scales of your white man's justice. That is finished. She rode her horse until she was just feet from him. But the debt, the one you made with the bread that one remains. It is between you and the people. You stood in the middle. You turned your back to us, and you turned your back to them. You offered your life to stop the blood. You did not pay a blood debt with more blood. You paid it with yourself. She looked at him, a long, searching gaze. This changes the trial. This changes the law. She turned her horse, "The debt is not paid," she called out, her voice for all to hear. "It is only changed." With a single sharp cry from Chaitin, the 700 warriors began to move, but they were not charging. They were not leaving. In a maneuver of perfect, practiced discipline, the warriors on the ridge turned their horses. They turned their backs to the fort, to the town, to the direction Pike was being taken. They did not pursue. The hunt was over. They rode down from the ridge. They reformed the circle. They surrounded the Rourke ranch. Their lances pointed not in, but out. The circle was no longer a noose. It was no longer a courtroom. It was a shield. They sat, silent, on their ponies, a living wall of 700, their gazes fixed on the small cabin, and on the man in the center. They were waiting. The trial by combat was over, the trial of what he would become that had just begun. 3 days passed, the dust raised by Captain Evans and his soldiers, taking the dying. Cuffed Pike back to Fort Horizon had long since settled. The air, which had thrummed with violence, was now quiet, but it was not the empty, lonely quiet Caleb had known before. It was a living silence, filled with the murmur of a camp, the nicker of ponies, the low voices of 700 people who had not left. They had stayed. The circle of warriors, now a protective, watchful ring, not a noose. The Rourke ranch had become a neutral ground, a place of waiting. The townsfolk from Ash River, those who had not fled in terror, had returned to their homes, but a few, led by the blacksmith and Mrs. Albright, had returned to the ranch, bringing food not as charity, but as a tentative first offering. On the morning of the 4th day, Chief Dasan sent a call. The low, steady beat of a single drum summoned everyone. The 700 warriors gathered in the yard, dismounted, forming the vast circle of their nation. But this time, they left an opening, and into that opening stepped the small, nervous delegation from Ash River. They stood on the edge, witnesses, no longer a mob, just people. There were no weapons raised, the lances were rested on the ground, the rifles were slung. The flags of war had been replaced by the simple feathers of council. Caleb stood on his porch, his arm bandaged by one of the Red Mesa healers. Nayeli was beside him, her own arm in a sling, her strength returning daily. Tala stood on the ground just in front of him, her shoulder heavily wrapped, her body stiff, her face unreadable. Mother Luyana stepped into the center. She raised her hands, and the low murmur of the crowd died. "The Blood Brothers' trial," she announced, her voice a clear, strong thread in the morning air, "is complete." She turned her sharp, ancient eyes on Caleb. "The man from the House of Silence rode with the Red Mesa. He bled with our warriors. He faced his own people, not with a rifle, but with the truth. He stood in the line of fire and offered his own life to stop the blood." She looked at the circle of warriors. "The debt of the bread, the debt of the water, it was a debt of life. He has paid it. He paid it with courage. He paid it with action. The scales are balanced. The debt is gone." A low murmur of approval, of relief, passed through the 700. A space opened in the circle of elders, and Chaitin, the scarred war leader, stepped forward. He walked to Caleb, his face no longer a mask of suspicion, but of something else, respect. He held in his hand a single, white eagle feather, bound with red sinew. "The council does not pass a sentence of death," Chaitin said, his deep voice formal. "The trial is over. We offer something new. We offer a new name." He held the feather out to Caleb. "We offer the title of Kiai, blood brother to the Red Mesa. From this day, if you take this, you have a place at our fires. Our lodges are open to you. Our enemies are your enemies." He paused. "And your house will be a sanctuary for us, as ours is for you." Caleb looked at the feather. This was more than he had ever imagined. It was not just forgiveness. It was inclusion. He slowly reached out his hand, his fingers closing over the smooth, strong quill. "But," a new voice said, "Chief Dasan." Dasan stepped forward, his tall, powerful form drawing all eyes. He looked at Caleb, and for the first time, Caleb saw something in the chief's stone-like gaze that was not judgment. It was calculation, and perhaps warmth. "The council offers a place at the fire," Dasan said. "That is good, but this man, he did not just save my people. He saved my daughters." He looked from Caleb, who stood holding the feather, to Tala, who was watching her father with a new, sudden tension. "The law of the Red Mesa is satisfied," Dasan continued. "But the world has changed. The bridge that Mother Luyana spoke of, it cannot be built with one man. It must be built with family." He looked at the Ash River delegation. "You have seen what this man is. We have seen what he is. He stands between two worlds, and so does she." He motioned to his daughter. "This woman, Tala, shield of the people, she stands with him. Her hand was in his when the guns were raised. I saw it." Dasan looked directly at Caleb. "A place at our fire is not enough. A house needs a family. If you wish it, you can be bound, not just by our laws, not just by your laws, but by a new law, made here. A wedding, with 700 warriors and the people of Ash River as your witnesses." The air in the yard became still as death. This was unthinkable. Caleb turned. He looked at Tala. Her face, which had been a mask of warrior's pride, was suddenly terribly vulnerable. For the first time, he saw not the giant, not the shield, not the killer. He saw a woman. Her eyes, which had never flinched from a fight, were wide, locked on his, and in their dark depths, he saw a new, raw emotion, the terrifying, paralyzing fear of rejection. She, who had faced down an army, was terrified of his answer. He did not let her wait. He did not let that fear exist for more than a second. He stepped off the porch, closing the small distance between them. He did not touch her. He just looked into her eyes. He took the eagle feather and gently, respectfully, tucked it into the leather band that held her hair. "Tala," he said, his voice low, "for her alone." But in the silence, it carried, "My life was tied to yours from the moment I offered you that bread. I have just been waiting for my heart to catch up." "Yes." A single shuddering breath escaped her. The warrior's mask did not return, but a new light, a fierce, bright, burning joy, lit her eyes from within. She did not smile with her mouth, but her entire being seemed to smile. The ceremony was immediate. It was not a thing of white veils and churches. It was a thing of earth and sky. The 700 warriors formed the circle, tight and protective, the children of the Red Mesa, and the half-dozen pale-faced, wide-eyed children from Ash River were brought into the center. They ran back and forth, weaving, passing flowers made of dried grass and small, purple desert blooms from one to another, a living, laughing thread binding the two groups. Caleb and Tala stood in the center, on the bare dirt of the yard. Nayeli, her face glowing, stood beside them. Mother Luyana came forward. She held not a book, but a single, long, soft leather thong. She took Caleb's left hand. She took Tala's right. She placed their palms together. "You are two," she chanted, her voice thin and strong. "You were the giver, and the one who received. You were the enemy, and the one who was saved." She began to wrap the leather cord around their joined wrists, binding them together. "Now, you are one, the one who gives, and the one who receives. You will feed each other. You will be a shield for each other. Your blood is one. Your debt is one. Your life is one. What the bread started, the blood has sealed. What the blood has sealed, let no man, no army, no law ever break." She tied the final knot, simple and strong. They were bound. A roar went up from the 700, a deep, joyous sound that shook the hills. Nayeli stepped forward, her good hand resting on their joined shoulders. She spoke first in her own tongue, a fast, musical blessing. Then she translated, her voice ringing with happiness and a new, profound authority. "My sister, my brother," she said, "from this day, the Rourke Ranch is no more. This is the house of the bridge. This is the house of bread. Let it be known, from the Red Mesa to the White Towns, that from this day forward, any man, Any woman, any child, red or white, soldier or traveler, hungry or hunted can come to this door. They can knock, and they will be given bread. They will be given water, and no gun will be raised against them. This is the law of this house. The afternoon faded. The warriors and the townsfolk shared a great, strange feast of roasted deer and settlers' beans. The tension was gone, replaced by a cautious, fragile peace, as dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep, velvet purple. Caleb and Tala found themselves, as if pulled by a magnet, walking away from the fires. They walked, their hands still loosely, shyly, joined, to the barn. They stood in the quiet, straw-scented gloom, in the exact spot where their first, furious kiss had taken place. The air was cool, the only light a pale square of twilight from the open door. He turned to her. She turned to him. They stood for a long time, just looking. He, a man who had been hollowed out by grief. She, a woman who had been defined by war. Slowly, he raised his bound hand, lifting hers with it. He untied the leather cord, his movements deliberate. The tie was broken, but the bond remained. He let the cord fall to the ground. He raised his hands, not to her hair, not to her lips, but to her shoulders, his thumbs gently tracing the line of her collarbone. She was so tall, so strong. She was his wife. She mirrored him, her own large, warm hands coming to rest on his chest, her fingers uncurling, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. She had done this before, in anger, in passion. Now she did it in peace. He leaned in, his body fitting against hers, and gently rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that, eyes closed, just breathing each other in. No smoke, no blood, just the scent of hay and leather and the clean, warm skin of the person who was his home. "Caleb," she whispered, her breath soft against his lips. "Tala," he whispered back. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, angry kiss of the night before the battle. It was not a collision. It was a landing. It was slow and deep and certain. It was a kiss of profound, quiet promises, of shared winters, of fences to be mended, of a life to be built from the foundations of two broken worlds. Her lips were soft, yielding, tasting of the air and the coming night. Her hands moved from his chest, her arms circling his neck, pulling him closer, her strong body leaning into his, not for battle, but for support. His own arms wrapped around her waist, holding her, anchoring himself. They exchanged long, slow kisses, each one a discovery, a confirmation, a testament. There was no hurry. They had, for the first time, all the time in the world, from the day Caleb Rourke, a man running from his own ghosts, offered a piece of dry bread and a skin of water to two giant Apache sisters on the sun-scorched earth. His life was no longer his own. It ceased to be a story about guilt. It became the story of a bridge built by a single meal, witnessed by 700 warriors, and sealed by a love as fierce, as defiant, and as real as the western sky itself. It was a place where the greatest debts were not paid in gold, or even in blood, but by the person you chose, in the end, to become. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West Stories 1850. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. We love to hear from you and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video. And for more stories like this one, show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.